What you'll hear on Patreon.
And so if they accept that planning at scale is not possible, then it isn't possible for healthcare and for education either. And yet they just assert that these sectors are possible. And I think this is why the market socialists regularly collapse into just social democrats. They just accept that the best that we can do is a mixed economy and then don't question why it's okay for these sectors, but not these other sectors. Whereas I think where I'm coming from is arguing that there might be something to some sectors where it's just really rebarbative to economic planning. I don't know why that might be. We need to investigate that. And so I'm not asserting that we can plan absolutely everything yet. I hope that we can, but so long as we have this North Star of always aiming towards trying to decommodify as much as possible, remove markets as much as possible, and in the process, it's sort of an experimentation as we move forward through policy, and treat it as a sort of scientific endeavor where we try to study why certain sectors may be amenable to decommodification, other sectors not, or parts of sectors. And then at the end of the day, if in 100 years' time, 250 years' time, we find that we have achieved a 75% decommodified global economy, but there's 25%. I don't know, maybe it's restaurants. Let's just say, for whatever reason, restaurants is just really, really hard to do decommodified restaurants. But we want restaurants, and so we'll allow that. Then that, I suppose, that's the best that we can do. But we need to hold on to that North Star. I would say that social democrats, at least since the 1970s, have lost hold of that North Star, and certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'm a science writer, a political journalist. I've written two books. The first came out in 2014 with 0 books. It was Austerity, Ecology, and the Collapse of Porn Addicts. And then the second one was The People's Republic of Walmart, which co-authored with Canadian economist Michal Rosworski. My work has appeared in Nature, The New Scientist, MIT Technology Review, Science, The Guardian, the Daily Telegraph. I worked in Brussels for many years covering climate policy and science policy at the European Union.
The main way that I've come across your work is through your book on austerity ecology. I think that's the first thing that I came across. But I also am a huge fan of your book, People's Republic of Walmart, and I assign it to my students. And I wondered if you could give a sense of what that book was about.
It's supposed to be a sort of popular introduction to the economic calculation debate, sometimes called the socialist calculation debate, which was a debate between economists. It began basically in the 1920s as to whether it was feasible to plan an economy, to have economic planning. And in the last few years, since the book has come out, that has really exploded. The conversation about that has really exploded again. But when Michal and I were initially writing it, this was something that wasn't really a major topic, even on the left. That there wasn't a lot of focus on the question of economic planning. Why is this book that's an introduction to a very dry topic of economic calculation entitled People's Republic of Walmart? Because the sort of claim made in sort of more conservative circles is that economic planning fails because there are simply too many, well, for two reasons, basically. There's the first is that there's simply too many variables in any sort of supply chain, in any sort of production process for that to be to be to be tracked by a sort of an army of bureaucrats in a sort of a government planning office, compared to the very simple process of the price signal in the market. And the second reason is that that there's a lot of tacit knowledge that exists within the economy, that it emerges through the buying and selling in the marketplace, and that knowledge once again would have to be sought out by this army of bureaucrats. And inevitably there would be gaps there, because this army of bureaucrats will always have some sort of there will always be lacuna in their information gathering, and those gaps in knowledge will result in shortages, and those shortages will result in political sort of chaos that drives the emergence of authoritarianism. Therefore, it is best for basically everything to be allocated through market signals rather than through the price signal in markets rather than through economic planning. And the argument that we make, that Michal and I make, is that, well, Walmart, the largest corporation in the world, it certainly exists within a sea of prices, but internally, it is an entirely planned economy, and it is at a scale comparable to the Soviet Union in roughly the 1970s. Um, so the idea that the larger that you get, that you can't plan at scale, is proven false by the very existence of the most capitalist company that exists, the largest company in the world, Walmart. So we tried to do a bit of political jujitsu there, where we use the greatest example of capitalist success as a rationale for explanations, evidence for the feasibility of planning, of economic planning at great scale.
Can you give me a sense of what that planning looks like? In the book, you compare it to the disastrous introduction of internal markets versus what it actually, that when people work together, how smoothly it goes. That planning actually, in this, at least internally, works better than markets. So, could you give me a sense of how that happens?
Sure. So one of the things that there's an enormous amount of literature within business studies on exactly what makes Walmart work, and that's what we investigated, or some of the things that we investigated in our research, and um, the but it has to understand that there is a radical reaching in through the supply chain, sort of reaching in of information and the sharing of information between the suppliers and Walmart. In fact, actually, quite deep into the supply chain, beyond just the immediate suppliers. And the business scholars describe this as a sort of firmification of the supply chain. And in all of the contracts, there's a commitment to this immediate sharing of information, but it goes both ways. So the minute that anything is taken off the shelf and sold in a Walmart, that information is also relayed back through the supply chain to the various different levels of suppliers. Again, this is a sort of firmification of the supply chain, and that obviously requires a great deal of trust, but it is crucially enabled by a whole series of technologies that have developed over the last 30, 40 years to enable that information to be sent out immediately through the supply chain the minute something's sold, so that everybody along the supply chain can adjust their predictions about what they should be producing. Um, the contrast that we have there is a very, very, very simplified version of the story. Go into much more detail in the book. So when Sears was taken over by a figure who was very much a sort of uber capitalist, a Randian, and horrified that when he looked internally at Sears, the different departments, of course, they told each other their different information about what they were selling, and the marketing department worked with the vacuum cleaner department, and so on and so forth, as anybody does within any large or any firm. And he was horrified at this because this is communism. There should instead be the different departments should compete against each other, and that would produce superior outcomes. But immediately marketing department isn't speaking any longer to the vacuum cleaner department. Um, the the various different departments are competing against each other, and so if it made sense for them to sell something or to get in a stock of some item that was made out of house, it would make more that they could get more cheaply than something made in house. They would do so because that would make more sense for their unit. But for the company as a whole, that undermined those other departments, which overall undermine the profitability of the organization. And the end result was sort of the collapse of Sears that everybody knows about. So Yeah, we have again, we use this is our political jujitsu where we take the example of the application of capitalist principles and market principles in Sears, and showed that how it was a disaster. And then through the rest of the book, we look at other examples of both the planning, the work that didn't work. So we talk about the great question immediately is, well, what about the Soviet Union? The Soviet Union did collapse, and we turn the story on its head, where it isn't the planning that leads to the authoritarianism, but we show how historically it was the Stalinist counter revolution that introduced the authoritarianism that undermined the system of planning, rather than the planning that led to Stalin.
When you were explaining the sort of internal planning that goes on, well, before I get to that, it made me think just now that, you know, you kind of introduce these sort of internal markets, and you just show how internal markets lead to you do such a good job in the book of explaining how internal markets just led to ruin and how it all just became very chaotic. And I've been in a situation like that with internal markets where somebody had the bright idea, oh, we'll just get all the different departments to compete against each other for
Yeah.
resources, and then they're going to be much more efficient. And, because they're competing. And then you look in the next department, you're like, they're teaching the same things we are to 6 students. And we're teaching, for 6 students, you're just duplicating work. It was horrible for the institution as a whole. And this was somebody just like, introducing that. But it's interesting how what was a free market, not free market, a market produced accidentally a kind of socialism, at least internally, that horrified the new CEO, I'm not sure what he was, of Sears. And he said, no, 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 we have to break this down, not realizing that this was a kind of organic development, that this is just what would work best. But I can hear the voice of the critic saying, well, when you were describing internal planning, you start with that price mechanism. You start with a purchase that sends a signal.
Yeah.
So, yes, these are little islands of planning, but they exist within, as you said, a sea of prices.
Yes.
So, does that really translate then if you take away that external sea of prices that creates this internal kind of socialism, if you want to call it that?
Right. So the argument we make in the book, which is confused, like some people have confused this, is not, we do not make the argument that it is feasible to completely eliminate prices entirely from the global economy. We don't say it isn't possible either. It's an open hypothesis. The challenge that we are making is the claims made that planning at scale is not possible, and that the Soviet Union also, I mean, we have to remember the Soviet Union also existed within a sea of prices. It was an island of planning. Externally, it sold many of its products for hard currency, to purchase other commodities that it couldn't make internally. So it wasn't autarkic like North Korea, where they make absolutely everything. But certainly, as socialists, we would hope that the hypothesis that it is feasible to eradicate um, um, prices completely should hold, precisely for this reason, that there's a there's a gap between let me put it another way, the set of all things that are useful, that are beneficial to humans, is larger than the set of all things that are profitable. So we need and the if something is profitable and we know it to be harmful to ourselves, there is an incentive for that product to continue to be produced. If there's something that is not profitable, but is beneficial to us, or even isn't sufficiently profitable, there's no incentive for it to be produced. And so what we have there is a situation where the products in society, the goods and services that are made in society, are made on the basis of an abstract, amoral, unconscious incentive, profit, that we don't control. And so we are at the mercy of this amoral, unconscious entity. And we need to liberate ourselves to be able to design history, to be able to fully liberate ourselves from from the domination of this abstract entity that sometimes produces things that are of great benefit to us, and sometimes produces things that are great harm, and very often will not produce things that are beneficial to us if they aren't profitable. So the more that we can push the price signal out of our out of the economy, the greater the role that we can consciously control our society democratically. A great example of this would be, so at the beginning of the pandemic, the for a number of decades, large pharmaceutical companies had largely got out of the business of really investing money in vaccine research. Vaccine research did continue, but it was largely done by university labs, government labs, not-for-profit government labs. Um, the reason is that with vaccines, like with antibiotics, generally, not always, but generally, it's once and it's done. You might need some boosters, but otherwise, it's not a chronic disease. It's not like a chronic disease where you have to take a set of pills every day for the rest of your life. So there's a lot less profit in it. And so it just made much more sense for the large pharmaceutical companies to get out of that business. At the beginning of the pandemic, recognizing this was an issue, Operation Warp Speed. I mean, there's a few precursors to Operation Warp Speed. The BARDA, which is a government-owned biomedical advanced research sort of agency, had already been distributing billions of dollars to the pharmaceutical companies to get things going. And then with the Operation Warp Speed under Trump, this was a sort of an extension of that program. And additionally, there were what are called advanced purchase agreements, saying to the pharmaceutical companies that don't worry, if this particular vaccine doesn't work, we will still purchase a certain amount of them, which guaranteed profits to those corporations. So it was a form of economic planning, because the pharmaceutical companies were worried early on in the pandemic that the COVID would be just like SARS or MERS, that as deadly as it was, as those were, in fact, in many cases, turns out to be less deadly, more deadly than COVID was, but that it would fizzle out, and that they would invest all these billions in vaccine development, and then they'd have a bunch of vaccines on their hands that they don't need to distribute. So the profit mechanism right there is showing how something of enormous benefit to humans, if it's not profitable, or even not profitable enough, will not be produced. This is a clear demonstration of how the more that we can, so you took the state, that is to say, the democratically elected entity that does not need to make a profit, to intervene to just decide production.
Another example that you often give that I find quite compelling is antibiotics. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? Because I find that really shocking.
So we're still really stuck in a situation where, for about 40 years, pharmaceutical companies largely got out of the business of doing any research into, or very much research into, antibiotics, because exactly the same reason. If you take a course of antibiotics, a few days later, in the case of most infections, you stop taking the course, the infection has cleared up. With some more tricky infections, you may need to say, such as for tuberculosis, you may need to take a course of antibiotics for 4 or 5 months. But again, the whole point is to eradicate the infection. At the end of that, if the antibiotics are working, you don't need to take them anymore. So again, they just are insufficiently profitable. So this is why the large pharmaceutical companies, largely got out of the development of antibiotics. And as a result of that, we haven't really developed a new classes of antibiotic in 40 years. And antibiotics act on bacteria. There will be inevitably a series of bacteria that through the course of random evolutionary mutations, will be resistant to those antibiotics. Eventually, over time, because those resistant bacteria are able to reproduce at a greater rate than the ones that are susceptible to the antibiotics, those resistant bacteria will dominate. And this is just evolution; it's inevitable. There's um, nothing that can be done about that. We can certainly speed up that process and endanger ourselves by distributing antibiotics willy-nilly, say for viral infections, or by their use within animal agriculture to reduce low-level infections and therefore increase the animal mass and therefore the profitability of the agribusinesses. But even if we didn't do that, we would still confront the problem of this evolutionary arms race between ourselves and bacteria, the mutations of bacteria. And so, in that arms race, we have to keep producing new classes of antibiotic. Otherwise, the one side in this war, this arms race, is continuing to develop new arms, and we're just like we're AWOL. We're absent without leave. We've retreated from the battlefield, and so government sort of policymakers try to think of all sorts of different ways to incentivize pharmaceutical companies to get back into the business of developing antibiotics. And I mean, that is itself a form of economic planning in recognizing that the profit incentive market signals are insufficient, and so we have to sort of tweak them. I think an even simpler way would just be for the government to take over the pharmaceutical sector and treat it sort of the way that we do with the post office, where profitable routes subsidize unprofitable routes. So to send a package from Vancouver to Calgary is a very profitable route, but sending a package from Vancouver to Whitehorse is not very profitable, because Whitehorse is, for international listeners, is a small population center. But the price of sending a package to both these locations is exactly the same, because by dint of being a Canadian citizen, you have the right to send packages to anywhere in the country for a given price. And so this way, what we could do is those unprofitable sectors of parts of the pharmaceutical sector could be subsidized by the profitable ones. There are lots of profitable sectors. Let's use that money to subsidize the profitable ones within the public sector.
The scariest thing that I find about that is like something that we desperately need as human beings. We need, you don't want to live in a world that doesn't have antibiotics. But
Yeah.
because it's not profitable, or it's becoming less profitable to produce something, you just take a course of antibiotics and you're done. We may not produce more of them, and that's really bad for humanity.
Yeah, I would say that it is a threat to humanity on the scale of climate change, perhaps even more, not existential, but certainly threatening to our way of life, because almost all of modern medicine, from surgeries to giving birth to just sticking a suture, in your arm, depends upon a background of antimicrobial protection. Once that's gone, we retreat to a sort of Victorian era of medicine, where we are not able to halt infections. All of those sorts of medical interventions, such as surgery and other things that I mentioned, now become incredibly dangerous, much more dangerous than they are at the moment. Just regular infections, scratch from a rose bush. If you get an infection there, suddenly perhaps you might your life might be threatened. And so the only way that at that point that we would be able to save your life, perhaps, is by cutting off your arm, the way that this happened in the 19th century. It's very frightening. I would say. Let me put it another way. I can't remember her name now, but she was a former chief scientific advisor to the European Commission when I was working in Brussels, and she said, Sally Davies, she said that this was a threat on a par with climate change. And yet, for some reason, there isn't a mass movement, sort of activist movement pushing for the nationalization of the pharmaceutical sector to overcome this challenge. Um, the only thing I can think is that we exist in a moment where the left, the activist left, is convinced of the sins of modernity, and climate change, a sort of crude reading of the problem of climate change, suggests that modernity is the problem. It isn't, but many people sort of take that reading or have a sort of vague conception that we made an error some time, took the wrong fork in the road with the Industrial Revolution. Namely, Klein thinks that it's the scientific method itself that was the problem, that the Baconian desire to dominate nature was the original sin. But antibiotic resistance suggests that, if anything, we need a lot more modernity. And so to solve the problem, we need more science, more medical intervention, more rationality. We need, and that's something that I don't think is, doesn't offer the same narrative about sin that the climate change offers, the movement.
It strikes me that there's this equation or conflation of science and capitalism and modernity where it's
Yeah.
just to hell with it all sort of thing. I want to come back to that, this idea of modernity and the environmental movement, but just to stay on this example, not only do we stop making drugs that we really need, but it's created this whole industry for creating new needs, new illnesses, new kinds of chronic illness. And that becomes a massive industry. I was always very reluctant to criticize big pharma. It always struck me as this kind of like lazy critique, and I would always say, especially when it comes to like their psychological or psychiatric interventions. And I would always say, look, you wouldn't have a market if you didn't have a culture that was receptive to this. But then I wrote an article. I was commissioned to write an article on the opiate crisis, and I was horrified.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
like the line between like the drug dealer on the street and the guy selling the opiates for a pharmaceutical company was so like permeable. Like you had strippers in lab coats like hawking this stuff.
Yeah, no, I mean,
It's crazy.
this is markets. This is what markets do. Um, if something is profitable, it must be done. It is the imperative of the company to do so. There is a great error made by a lot of people in the sort of sense that the reason that there is a problem with big pharma is its bigness. I mean, that's a big pharma. And that is if some smaller pharmaceutical company would do exactly the same thing. It's the market that's the problem, not the size. It's not the size of the firm. And so long as we continue to identify the problem, or identify the cause of antisocial behavior as size rather than markets, we are distracted from the source of the error, and we will continue to reproduce that error. There's as a result of this, we have a lot of sort of embrace of alternative medicine with no scientific evidence for the efficacy of this stuff whatsoever. And it's a real sort of retreat from scientific modernity. The widespread embrace of homeopathy, of naturopathy, of acupuncture, and so on and so forth. And to some extent, this is understandable with respect to people's frustrations with the the various villainies that you've just listed with respect to the opioid crisis of the large pharmaceutical companies. But those the providers of all of those alternate medicines are also are actors within the market, and so they have an incentive to in exactly the same way as the large pharmaceutical companies to do whatever it takes to make money, including hawking sugar pills that do absolutely nothing compared to a placebo. Um, the what's his name? Um, British Ben Goldacre. Myself there. Ben Goldacre, great campaigner against alternative the shills and charlatans and quacks of alternative medicine. He also wrote a great book critiquing the villainy, the various villainies of the large pharmaceutical companies, and I think we have to be able to have this hold these two ideas in our head at the same time, that we battle the quacks and the charlatans of the alternative medicine industry, and the villainies of large pharmaceutical companies. And the solution to both of these problems is the removal of medicine entirely from the market. In places like Canada or Britain, we have, or to a certain extent, removed sort of half of medicine from the market through the provision of, in the case of the UK, the National Health Service; in Canada, the Canadian Health Service. Although, if you don't fund it properly, if you introduce internal markets, you result in all sorts of pathologies as well. But nevertheless, in principle, the idea of public healthcare is a very, very good one. But we've only done half of the job there. That we've taken the hospital, or provision of hospital services and clinics out of the market, but we haven't taken the pharmaceutical sector out of the market. We need to do that as well. Ben Goldacre puts it very very well. I think that big pharma being shit does not mean that magic beans cure cancer. That we have to be very, very clear-headed in our critique of big pharma, of alternative medicine, and the marketization and underfunding of public healthcare. All those three things at the same time. And we have to be careful that in our critiques of alternative medicine, we don't defend big pharma, and that in our critiques of big pharma, we don't fall into the pseudo-science of alternative medicine. And in our defense of public healthcare, we don't fall into the trap of being blinded to the underfunding, to the marketization, to the internal markets, and to bureaucratic, self-serving actors within the healthcare system as well.
Of course, a critic will say that this bureaucratic, self-serving individual is a feature of planning.
They're not wrong. They're absolutely not wrong. This is perhaps a much more one of the greatest critiques of public ownership. If you bring something into the public sector, the actors in the people who work in that sector have an interest in that sector maintaining itself and expanding itself and earning more money. That's absolutely true. The only solution to that is that problem is exacerbated the less the democratic control of that public sector entity is. So the greater the democratic control, the more that the actors in that public sector entity are forced to become creatures of the democratic majority, of just carrying out their just executing the orders of the democratic majority. It is when they become an entity on their own that they, with some level of remove from democratic control, that the bureaucracies metastasize. In many ways, that is exactly the same process that we see within. The problem is almost identical to that of markets, in that we have an actor that is self-interested, that is not democratically controlled. In the case of markets, It is the amoral, unconscious profit incentive that is deciding for us what is going to be produced, or what is, or what will not be produced. And in the case of the uncontrolled runaway bureaucrat or bureaucratic sort of agency, once again, it is an actor, an agent that is not under the democratic control of the majority. It's almost exactly the same problem. And so the solution to the very real problem of runaway bureaucracies is not the introduction of markets, because that's, you're just replicating the creation of an actor, an agent that decides for you what is going to happen. It's just, in this case, it's unconscious, and in the case of the bureaucrats, those are actual conscious human actors.
The other thing too that you have to realize is that, I teach modules in, I teach sociology to healthcare professionals and to nurses and this sort of thing. And one thing that really disturbed me that was that over time I watched as all the clinical programs got management modules. And I was like, well, why are they learning about management when they're so young? They're just like coming fresh out of university. They're going to go into like entry level positions. It was like, oh, because like the life, how long you're actually going to spend in these positions is not that long. They need to make sure they get off the front line and go up into management as fast as possible. And I was like horrified by that. Like, but the thing is, if you're going to understaff and like be obsessed with efficiency, people burn out. They burn out very quickly, and it becomes, why would you want, you cannot work long hours in these kinds of shifts.
Mhm.
You have to have some kind of entry or exit plan, and for a lot of people it's get up into management, and social work is the same way. So
Right.
it's, because it's such exhausting work, and it's like, as the NHS, for instance, in the UK gets encumbered with more and more social problems that they can't possibly solve, as social work gets encumbered with all these problems, your caseload gets higher and higher and higher,
Yeah.
and you have more and more people coming. It just becomes a huge mess.
Yeah, no, and those of us who, from sort of liberals and social democrats, democratic socialists, and um, uh, everybody on the left needs to be that is willing to defend notions of public healthcare or public anything, public education, whatever sort of sector that either exists within within the public sector, or that we want to bring into the public sector. We need to arm ourselves with knowledge of the pathologies of public sector entities, of bureaucracies. If we don't, we open ourselves up to very legitimate criticism, and the best possible criticism from the right, from people who want to privatize everything. And it is not enough for us to just blindly say, just defend public sectors without imagining that there are real issues.
Visit patreon.com/Ashley A. Frawley for part 2.